Is it possible that a body of water can be a sea, a lake, and a legal designation that has never appeared in any prior international treaty, all at the same time, in the same location? That is not a riddle. It is the actual condition of the Caspian Sea, the largest enclosed body of water on Earth. 5 nations share its coastline for nearly 3 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed. Those nations came within a diplomatic hair's width of armed conflict, trying to answer a question that should have been simple. What are we, exactly, dealing with here? The answer they eventually produced is more revealing than the question, and it still does not tell the whole story. Subscribe now. What comes next will rewrite what you thought you knew. Don't let the algorithm bury it. By the time this investigation is complete, you will understand why 5 governments, Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan, gathered in 2018 and signed a treaty that invented a legal category with no precedent in international law, and why that category still fails to describe what the Caspian actually is. The textbooks call it a lake. The maps call it a sea. Neither is accurate, and the gap between those 2 labels contains more concentrated wealth, more ecological catastrophe, and more buried human history than most of the world's continents can claim combined. We will move through 7 stages of this story, from the courtroom to the seafloor, from a vanished ocean to a fortress submerged beneath 12 feet of water. What you will find at the end of this journey is not a settled answer. It is a far more interesting question. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who actually wants to know what they don't teach in school, hit subscribe right now. We go this deep on every single video. Don't lose this channel. In August 2018, 5 nations signed a treaty in the Kazakh port city of Aktau that formally classified the Caspian Sea as neither a sea nor a lake, a legal designation that had never appeared in any prior document in the history of international law. That sentence deserves a moment of stillness, not because it is surprising that governments produce unusual language, but because the distinction between sea and lake is not a matter of appearance or local tradition. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the foundational legal framework governing roughly 2/3 of the Earth's surface classification, determines everything. A sea grants each coastal nation a territorial zone extending outward, with clearly defined rights to the seafloor beneath it. A lake is divided by direct agreement among the nations that share its shore. The difference between those 2 frameworks, applied to the Caspian, translates into hundreds of billions of dollars in oil and natural gas rights, the legal right to station military vessels, the authority to build cross-water pipelines, and the jurisdiction to enforce fishing regulations on a species that has existed since before the dinosaurs disappeared. Stop and translate that into physical reality. For 27 years after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the Caspian had no agreed legal status. The Soviet Union and Iran had bilateral treaties governing its use, but those treaties covered only 2 nations. When the USSR became 5 separate countries overnight, those agreements became functionally unenforceable. What followed was a period of genuine instability, competing oil exploration permits, disputed pipeline routes, and at least one incident, in 2001, in which Iranian naval vessels drove off an Azerbaijani oil exploration ship at gunpoint. These were not diplomatic misunderstandings. They were the direct consequence of a legal vacuum at the center of one of the most resource-rich basins on Earth. The 2018 Aktau Convention resolved the surface. Fishing zones, navigation rights, and environmental responsibilities were parceled out among the 5 coastal nations. But the treaty explicitly deferred the question that mattered most: how to divide the seabed. The phrase "they settled on special legal regime of the Caspian Sea" is, in the precise language of international law, a placeholder, a formal acknowledgement that the negotiating parties could not reach agreement on the most consequential question before them. Dressed in the language of resolution, what made the seabed question so resistant to agreement was not only the oil, it was what the seabed actually is. Because the floor of the Caspian does not behave like the floor of a lake. It does not even behave like the floor of most seas. And once you look at what is down there, what it is made of, where it came from, and how old it is, the classification problem begins to make a different kind of sense entirely. The floor of the Caspian Sea is not one geological world. It is 2 joined at the middle, and they do not belong to the same era. The northern basin, shallow, wide, reaching no more than roughly 30 feet in depth across vast stretches, rests on ancient continental crust, the kind of geology that underlies most of the land masses you have ever stood on. The southern basin is different in a way that geologists find difficult to communicate without sounding improbable. It sits on oceanic crust, dense, heavy, structurally distinct, technically a fragment of a vanished ocean. The central basin connects the two, transitioning between geological types with a structural complexity that has kept geophysicists productively employed for decades. That vanished ocean had a name: the Tethys Sea. It was not a local body of water. Roughly 50 million years ago, the Tethys covered most of what is now Eurasia, a warm, shallow epicontinental sea stretching from what we now call Spain to the borders of what is now Southeast Asia. As the African tectonic plate drove northward into the Eurasian plate, the Tethys was progressively compressed out of existence. The Himalayas rose, and in the geological collision zone, a series of landlocked remnants were left behind: the Black Sea, the Aral Sea, and the Caspian. Consider what that means. The Caspian is not a lake that became landlocked over geological time. It is the largest surviving fragment of an ocean that once covered a continent. What you are looking at when you look at a map of the Caspian Sea is a body of water roughly 371,000 square kilometers in area, larger than the state of Montana, that has been sitting in the same geological basin for approximately 50 million years, slowly evolving in complete isolation from every ocean on Earth. That isolation produces a paradox that took decades to explain. The Caspian is salty, but only about 1/3 as salty as the Atlantic Ocean. In a closed basin with no outlet, you would expect salt concentration to increase steadily over time as water evaporates and minerals accumulate. The Caspian's salinity has remained relatively stable for millions of years. The explanation involves the chemistry of sediment layers at the bottom of the basin. They act as a long-term buffer, absorbing and releasing minerals in a slow cycle that prevents runaway saline concentration. The mechanism works, but the precision of that stability, maintained across geological timescales without any external correction, still surprises researchers working in closed basin hydrology. The oil geology follows directly from this history. Oceanic crust, combined with 50 million years of accumulated organic sediment from a once, created the conditions for one of the most concentrated hydrocarbon deposits on Earth. Estimated reserves beneath the Caspian Basin reach roughly 50 billion barrels of oil, equivalent more proven reserves than most OPEC member nations hold individually. Those reserves exist because the Tethys Ocean once filled this space with life, and that life died and accumulated in layers, and 50 million years of heat and pressure converted it into the substance that 5 nations are now negotiating over with treaty language that everyone in the room acknowledged was deliberately incomplete. Which brings you to the edge of the Caspian, to a shallow lagoon on its western shore that, for 8 catastrophic years in the 20th century, served as the clearest possible demonstration of what happens when human decision-making collides with a geological system it does not fully understand. In 1980, Soviet engineers sealed a concrete dam across the channel, connecting the Caspian Sea to its western lagoon, and within 8 years, that lagoon had essentially ceased to exist. The lagoon is called Corabogas. The name translates, with grim appropriateness, as Blackthroat Gulf. It is a vast, shallow coastal inlet, roughly the size of the state of Connecticut, that sits slightly lower than the Caspian itself. Water flows from the Caspian into Corabogas Gulf continuously, evaporates in the intense Central Asian heat, and leaves behind deposits of mirabilite, sodium sulfate, a mineral used in industrial paper production, and glass manufacturing. The lagoon functions as the Caspian's natural pressure valve. It draws water westward and converts it into recoverable mineral wealth. The Soviet engineers dammed it because the Caspian's water level was declining through the 1970s, and losing water to evaporation seemed like the logical problem to address. The reasoning was straightforward. The consequences were not. Without its outlet, Corabogas Gulf lost roughly 90% of its volume within 8 years. The water receded, the salt crystallized across the exposed lake. What had been a functioning brackish ecosystem supporting a productive fishing industry became, by the late 1980s, a blinding white salt flat. A landscape so extreme it appeared in satellite imagery as a geometric wound on the Earth's surface. The Caspian's water level, meanwhile, continued its decline and then reversed course entirely, rising by nearly 8 feet in the years following the dam's construction. Driven by natural hydrological cycles, the dam had no capacity to influence. The dam was demolished in 1992. The lagoon began recovering, but the episode stands as one of the most consequential single-structure ecological interventions in recorded history. A concrete wall built to solve a problem it was never capable of solving that destroyed a functioning ecosystem in under a decade. That pattern, misclassification leading to catastrophic intervention, appears again in the water itself. The beluga sturgeon is a fish that has existed for approximately 120 million years. It predates most modern bird species by tens of millions of years. It is capable of living more than a century, growing to over 20 feet in length, and producing the most commercially valuable caviar on Earth. Prices for beluga caviar in specialty markets regularly exceed $3,000 per pound. The fish is found in any meaningful wild population, in essentially one location, the Caspian Sea. It is also critically endangered. The beluga's survival depends on long-distance migration. It spawns in the rivers flowing into the Caspian, particularly the Volga and the Ural. But the legal ambiguity of the Caspian means no single nation has ever held the authority to enforce consistent conservation standards across the full range of the fish's habitat. Each coastal country maintains its own regulations. Enforcement varies dramatically. Industrial-scale poaching has continued for decades. A species that survived the extinction event that ended the Cretaceous period is being driven toward collapse by a legal disagreement about what kind of water it lives in. The Caspian seal faces the same structural problem. It is found nowhere else on Earth. Its ancestors were Arctic seals that migrated southward into the Tethys remnant millions of years ago, became isolated as the sea receded, and have been evolving independently ever since. Their population has declined by more than 90% in the last century. The cause is the same: a shared body of water. No unified legal authority, no consistent enforcement mechanism. If what you just learned bothered you, good. That means you're paying attention. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because what we're investigating in the next video makes this look like the introduction. But the most unsettling part is still ahead, because what lies beneath the Caspian's shifting water level is not only the product of natural forces. Some of it was built by human hands. 12 feet below the surface of the southern Caspian, off the coast of Azerbaijan, stand the stone walls of a fortress built in the 13th century, and it has been underwater for most of the time since. The fortress is called Submerged. It was constructed on a small island near what is now the city of Baku, likely as a defensive structure protecting the approaches to the harbor. Within decades of its construction, the Caspian's water level rose and the island began to submerge. For most of the last 7 centuries, Submerged has remained underwater. During periods of particularly low water, most recently in the mid-20th century and again briefly in the 1980s, its upper walls have broken the surface, briefly visible from passing boats, before the water rose again and reclaimed them. The Caspian's water level has fluctuated by more than 15 feet in recorded history, with no identifiable human cause. Geologists attribute this to a combination of river inflow variability, atmospheric pressure systems over Central Asia, and the same deep geological dynamics that shaped the basin itself. The result, across centuries of settlement on its shores, has been a coastline in motion, swallowing harbors, stranding cities miles from the water's edge, periodically resurging structures built for a waterline that no longer exists. Imagine standing in a 10-story building. Now imagine the entire ground floor submerged and the building still standing. That is the range of vertical movement this coastline has experienced in recorded history alone. Its hill, the capital of the Khazar Khaganate, a medieval empire that controlled Silk Road trade routes from the 5th through the 10th century, and at its height, stretched from the Caucasus to the western steppes of what is now Ukraine, is believed to lie somewhere beneath the shallow northern Caspian. The city has never been fully excavated. Its approximate location is established from historical accounts and limited underwater survey data, but the combination of turbid water, broad, shallow coverage, and unresolved jurisdictional questions has prevented systematic archaeological investigation. One of the most significant medieval capitals in Eurasian history remains, in the most literal sense, underwater. The geological force producing those water level fluctuations is the same force, responsible for what may be the most visually dramatic feature of the entire Caspian region: the mud volcanoes of Azerbaijan. The country hosts nearly half of all the mud volcanoes on Earth, approximately 300 of them concentrated along the same hydrocarbon-rich coastal belt where the offshore oil platforms stand. The largest eruptions are visible from orbit. They eject columns of flaming gas, liquid mud, and rock fragments hundreds of feet into the air. They are produced by the same pressurized methane and hydrocarbon deposits that make the Caspian Basin so economically contested. The same deposits that sit beneath a seabed whose legal division was deliberately deferred in a treaty that everyone who signed it knew was unfinished. Everything you have seen in this investigation connects to a single underlying logic. The Caspian is a geological system that has been in continuous motion for 50 million years. Its water level rises and falls on timescales that dwarf recorded human history. Its seafloor is composed of two distinct types of crust from two different geological eras. Its biology has been evolving in isolation, long enough to produce species: the Caspian seal, the beluga sturgeon, dozens of endemic invertebrate populations that exist nowhere else on the planet, and the hydrocarbon wealth buried beneath it is the direct legacy of organic material that accumulated in the Tethys Ocean across tens of millions of years. What is the appropriate legal framework for a system like this? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the precise problem that international lawyers, geophysicists, environmental scientists, and 5 national governments have been attempting to resolve for 3 decades. The answer they produced in 2018's special legal regime is, in context, an honest acknowledgement of the limits of available categories. Not a failure of the negotiators, but a failure of the instruments. The legal concepts developed to govern seas and lakes were built on an assumption of geographical stability. The Caspian has never been stable. The more precisely you examine it, the less it fits any category that international law currently possesses. The implications project forward with increasing urgency. Climate projections for the Caspian Basin suggest its water level could decline by as much as 9 meters, roughly 30 feet, by the end of this century, driven by accelerating regional temperature increases and the resulting rise in evaporation. A 30-foot drop would reduce the Caspian's total surface area by a region roughly the size of the state of Georgia. Ports would be stranded miles from open water. Ecosystems dependent on specific depth ranges would collapse. The beluga's remaining spawning habitat would be further compressed, and the jurisdictional questions deferred in Actau in 2018 would require renegotiation for a body of water whose physical dimensions had fundamentally changed since the treaty was signed. The Caspian is not a special case. It is a preview. It is what happens when the geography that legal systems were designed to govern stops cooperating with the assumptions those systems were built on, and when the categories we inherited from 2,000 years of map-making prove insufficient for the geological reality they were always only approximating. What the Caspian ultimately reveals is not a failure of geography, it is a failure of nomenclature. We named this body of water a sea roughly 2,000 years ago, when ancient travelers encountered it and applied the only category they possessed for large bodies of salt water. We have been arguing about that word ever since. Not because the word is entirely wrong, but because the thing it describes has never stopped moving long enough to be definitively catalogued. The Caspian is a 50-million-year-old system doing what 50-million-year-old systems do, changing, shifting, evolving at its own pace and on its own terms. The legal disputes, the ecological interventions, the treaty language chosen to defer rather than resolve. These are not problems created by bad governance alone. They are the inevitable result of applying static categories to dynamic reality. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Not that the Caspian needs a better name, but that the act of naming itself, the insistence on settling the question of what a thing is before we fully understand what it does, may be the oldest and most persistent error in the human relationship with the natural world. Somewhere beneath the surface, the walls of Sabale are still standing. The sea that has no name is still asking for one. Every mystery we uncovered today leads somewhere deeper. Subscribe. The next investigation is already in progress.